Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into really fascinating place in time, the Gilgit frontier of British India in the late 19th century. And our source material is the words of Algernon Durand himself, a British military officer who was stationed in the region. His book, 1899, The Making of a Frontier, isn't just like some dry history. It's a firsthand account of what it was actually like to travel and work in this part of the world.
Yeah, what's so great about Durand's perspective is that you get this really raw and unfiltered view of life on the frontier. Like
Mhm.
from the dangerous journeys he took to his interactions with all the local rulers. It's almost like we can just step back in time and experience it all through his eyes.
Yeah, and some of the things he describes, it's really unbelievable, like treacherous mountain passes and crossing raging rivers on these rafts made of inflated bullock skins, and even these whispers of fairies and ancient legends. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. But before we get too swept away by all the adventure, we should probably talk about why this place, the Gilgit frontier, was so important to the British in the first place. Imagine like a giant chessboard, right, with the British and Russia as the players. Each one wants to control Central Asia, and Russia was moving steadily south. So for the British, the Gilgit frontier, all the way up in the Hindu-Kush mountains, it was like a crucial pawn blocking Russia's path towards India.
So this wasn't just some remote outpost; it was actually a front line in this huge geopolitical power struggle. So that makes Durand's journey and the things he did there even more significant, right?
Exactly. Durand himself says that if war broke out with Russia, there would be little stopping them from reaching the heart of Kashmir. And just getting to the Gilgit frontier was really dangerous. He describes this one pass, the Hatupir Pass, as 5 miles of just pure danger, tumbled rocks, loose sand, sheer drops. He even mentions finding human bones along the way.
Oh wow, that's pretty chilling. It's a good reminder of how different travel was back in the 19th century, especially in a place as unforgiving as this terrain. It makes you wonder what kind of person would want to do that sort of thing. What did Durand have to say about all the criticism of the frontier policy?
Well, Durand was very careful not to criticize his superiors directly. He did, however, point out that most of the criticism was coming from people who had never actually been to the Gilgit frontier. It's easy to judge from far away, but when you're there dealing with the realities of the region, it's a whole other story.
Yeah, and then there's that whole ordeal of crossing the Indus River. It sounds absolutely terrifying.
He describes being tossed around on this raft made of inflated bullock skins. He calls it a most exhilarating performance. You almost have to laugh reading it, but it just goes to show how important horses were for getting around in that kind of landscape. Durand even says that the official boats with their flat bottoms and inexperienced Kashmiri boatmen were often more dangerous than just relying on a good horse. He tells a story about his colleague Robertson, who lost all his equipment and almost 20 men when a boat capsized, almost in Italy. Just imagine losing all of that.
It really highlights how important animals were back then and the risks they took just to travel. It's incredible. Did Durand ever mention those mud flows?
Oh, yeah, he does. These were really sudden and devastating events where entire ravines would be filled with mud and boulders. They were a constant threat. It gives you a sense of just how powerful nature could be in this region. One minute you're walking along a pass, and the next you could be swept away by all this mud and debris.
Yeah, it definitely adds another layer of stress to an already stressful job. But through it all, Durand seems to have had a real connection with his horse, the Hoopshi, right?
Oh, absolutely. Durand describes him as the ideal mountain horse. Strong, sure-footed, and completely fearless. He even trusted the horse's instincts more than any of the human guides. It's almost like the Hoopshi was a partner in his adventures, helping him navigate all the steep slopes and unpredictable terrain.
So we're starting to get a sense of just how wild and unpredictable the Gilgit frontier could be. So who were some of the people Durand met on his travels?
This is where things get even more fascinating. The Gilgit frontier was like a crossroads of so many different cultures. You had the Kardards, known for their complex social structures and marriage customs, the Chitralis with their love of polo and their really impressive attire. They always wore brightly colored clothing, silver-plated saddles, and a hawk on their wrist. And of course, the people of Hunza and Nagar, each with their own distinct practices and beliefs.
So a real melting pot of cultures, and Durand, being the keen observer that he was, took note of it all.
Oh, he observed everything from the ceremonies to their daily lives. He even mentions the practice of slavery in Chitral. It's a reminder that while this might sound like a grand adventure to us, it was also a time and place with very different social norms.
It's true, exploring history isn't just about the exciting parts, it's also about confronting the darker aspects of the past, too.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that Durand Even though he was there as part of the British Empire, he seemed to approach these cultures with a mix of curiosity and respect. He was there to assert British influence, but he also took the time to really document the people, their customs, their beliefs.
Speaking of beliefs, Durand also wrote about all the folklore and mythology at the Gilgit frontier, particularly around this huge peak, Tirikmir. What did he find so intriguing about it?
Well, this is where we start to see a more mystical side to the region. Durand writes about legends of fairies, especially about these individuals called the Daniel, who were believed to be possessed by fairies. There's even a story about the Matar of Chitral's great-grandfather, who supposedly married a fairy, and their daughter still communicates with the royal family.
Wow, so these stories weren't just stories, they were part of their lives. What did these fairies look like?
Well, Durand says they had some unusual physical features like no knee or ankle joints and their toes point backwards. They were also known for, stealing things and playing tricks on people, tangling horses' manes, stealing grain, even possessing people.
That's really interesting. It's amazing how folklore can reflect the anxieties and beliefs of a culture.
Mm.
I mean, these fairies might have been mischievous, but they were definitely a powerful presence in the minds of the people.
Absolutely. And while Durand says he didn't have enough time to fully explore the folklore, you can tell that he was really fascinated by it. It adds another layer of complexity to an already fascinating place.
It's like these stories offer a different way of seeing the world, a world where reality and myth are kind of blurred. But we have to remember, this is all happening against this backdrop of political maneuvering and all these conflicts between the different groups in the region.
It really was a real-life Game of Thrones, with the Matar of Chitral, the thumbs of Hunza and Nagar. Everyone was competing for power-forming alliances and plotting against each other. And then you have the British trying to exert their influence and keep things somewhat stable. It was a really volatile mix.
So how did Durand, as this representative of the British Empire, navigate this incredibly complex web of relationships and rivalries?
That's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. You'll see how Durand's understanding of the Gilgit frontier and his role there changed as he faced new challenges and encountered the people of Hunza and Nagar.
So we've got this whole mix of political maneuvering and cultural clashes, these perilous journeys, and even a bit of folklore. It's amazing to think we're just scratching the surface of what Durand experienced on the Gilgit frontier. You were saying earlier that he had to navigate this web of alliances and rivalries between all these groups. It sounds like diplomacy was a really tricky thing in this part of the world.
Oh, it absolutely was. Durand really emphasizes how important it was to be careful and to question everything, because things weren't always what they seemed. He even says he had to train himself to disbelieve pretty much every story he heard, no matter how believable it sounded.
Wow, that's a good skill to have in any negotiation, not just in 19th century Central Asia. It makes me wonder what his interactions were like with all those rulers. He must have met some pretty strong personalities, especially with so much at stake.
Oh, he definitely did. And, despite all the intrigue and deception, Durand seems to have developed a certain respect for some of them, especially the Mestar of Chitral. He describes him as a very cunning and shrewd ruler, someone who wasn't afraid to use manipulation to get what he wanted. But he also portrays him as intelligent, charismatic, even funny in his own way.
It sounds like the Matar was someone you didn't want to mess with, someone who could command respect and fear at the same time.
Yeah.
What was their relationship like? Did Durand ever get a sense of what motivated the Matar?
I'd say their relationship was complicated, to say the least. The Metar was obviously a skilled politician, always looking for an advantage, but Durand also gives us these little glimpses into his personal life, like his devotion to his many children, his religious beliefs, even his love for a good polo match.
Yeah.
It reminds us that even in this high-stakes game of power, these rulers were still people with their own lives and beliefs.
It's really interesting how Durand manages to capture all those different layers, the political or the cultural, even the personal. You get a real sense of what life was like on this frontier, both for the British and the local people. But I'm curious, did Durand ever express any doubts about the role of the British Empire in all of this?
That's a good question, and it's something that starts to come up as we read further into his experiences. While Durand was carrying out his mission for the empire, he also saw the effects of colonialism firsthand, and it wasn't always good.
You're talking about the slave trade he witnessed in Chitral, right?
Yeah.
The way he describes it is so raw and honest. It's a stark reminder that history isn't always glamorous and exciting.
Exactly. He talks about families being torn apart, children being sold human lives, traded for goods. It's clear that he was really disturbed by it, even though he was part of the system that was ultimately profiting from it. This internal conflict is part of what makes Durand's story so fascinating. He's not just blindly following orders, he's wrestling with the complexities of the situation.
It reminds us that history is full of these moral gray areas, and we need to acknowledge that. But it sounds like his experiences with the slave trade weren't the only things that started to change his perspective.
That's right. As Durand went further into the Gilgit frontier, he faced challenges that made him question his own beliefs about how the British were approaching things. His visits to Hunza and Nagar in particular were really important in shaping his views.
I'm intrigued. What was it about Hunza and Nagar that made them so different?
Oh, remember that chessboard analogy we talked about and the great game between Britain and Russia? Hunza, with its history of raiding and taking slaves, was seen as a bit of a wild card, a potential threat to British interests. They were worried about the rulers there and their alliances, especially because of how close they were to those crucial mountain passes.
So when Durand went to Hunza and Nagar, he was stepping into a place full of tension and suspicion. What was the reaction to his arrival?
It was a bit of a mixed bag. The rulers of Hunza and Nagar did invite him, but there was a lot of ceremony and posturing. Durand talks about navigating these elaborate rituals, attending these really long dances, and trying to figure out what everyone really meant by what they said and did.
That sounds exhausting.
Yeah.
I can't imagine trying to keep my cool and interpret all those subtle cues in such a different cultural setting. Did anything in particular stand out to you about those encounters?
One thing Durand mentions almost in passing is how his military uniform just didn't fit in with the local architecture. He talks about getting caught on low doorways and feeling out of place among all the intricately carved wooden buildings. It's just this little detail that highlights the cultural differences he was trying to navigate.
It's those little details that really bring history to life. It's not just about treaties and battles. It's about the people and their experiences.
Yeah.
But you mentioned Durand faced some serious challenges in Hunza. What happened there?
Well, things took a bit of a dramatic turn when Durand ended up in a standoff with the Thumb of Hunza. The Thumb became convinced that Durand was plotting against him and basically held him hostage.
Wait, hostage? That's a pretty serious escalation. How did that happen?
Well, Durand had traveled to Hunza with a small group, and for whatever reason, maybe rumors or misunderstandings, the Thumb became really suspicious of him. He ordered the only bridge leading out of the valley to be blocked, essentially trapping Durand and his men.
Oh, wow. That's scary. With that raging river we talked about before, it wasn't like they could just swim to safety. How did Durand get out of that?
It took a lot of diplomacy patience, and probably a bit of luck. Durand managed to convince the Thumb that he wasn't there to cause any trouble. He emphasized the benefits of a peaceful relationship with the British, and eventually, after some tense negotiations, the bridge was reopened.
It sounds like Durand's ability to stay calm in a crisis was really important in preventing things from getting worse. Even a small fight could have had huge consequences for the region.
Absolutely. It's a real testament to his diplomatic skills that he was able to de-escalate the situation without violence. But this whole experience also changed how the British viewed the rulers of Hunza and Nagar.
So something that could have been a disaster actually ended up changing the course of events.
Exactly. Durand, having seen the Thumb's tactics firsthand, became convinced that the British needed to be more assertive to bring stability to the region. He started pushing for a stronger military presence, believing that was the only way to protect the trade routes and prevent future conflicts.
So things were about to get a lot more serious. It sounds like the Great Game was entering a new and more aggressive phase.
You could say that Durand's experiences in Hunza and Nagar and his growing concerns about Russian influence led him to play a key role in planning and carrying out the Hunza-Nagar expedition in 1891.
Hold on, an entire expedition. That's a major escalation.
This wasn't just a small border skirmish. It was a full-blown military campaign with British and Indian troops. The goal was to take control of those mountain passes, establish British control over Hunza and Nagar, and basically show Russia that the British weren't going to back down.
This is where Durand's first-hand account gets really intense. You're not just reading about history anymore. You're experiencing it through the eyes of someone who was right there in the middle of it all.
It's true. Durand doesn't hold back on the details he describes, leading charges, being shot at, and even being wounded in the final moments of victory. It just goes to show how far removed those armchair critics he mentioned were from the reality of life on the frontier.
It's one thing to talk about policy from a distance. It's another to be facing the danger and chaos of war, especially in such difficult terrain. What did Durand say about what happened after the campaign? Did things settle down once the British had control of Hunza and Nagar?
Well, that's where things get even more complicated. Winning a battle is one thing, but governing a territory you've just conquered is a whole other challenge. And Durand soon found himself facing a whole new set of problems. Problems that really tested his leadership and his understanding of the Gilgit frontier.
Okay, so we've traveled with Durand across these crazy mountain passes and explored the cultures of the Gilgit frontier and felt all the tension of the great game. Last time you were saying that governing these new territories, Hunza and Nagar create a bunch of new problems. What were some of the issues Durand ran into?
Well, imagine trying to force order on a region that had always been independent. The people of Hunza and Nagar, they were used to their own way of doing things, their own customs, their own leaders, and then suddenly they're under the control of the British Empire with all these new rules and regulations.
Yeah, that sounds like it would cause some issues, especially right after a conflict. Did Durand have any thoughts about how the locals reacted to this change?
Yeah, he talks about this feeling of unease, like everything was changing too fast. He noticed a change in the attitudes of the local rulers, kind of a mix of resentment and reluctant acceptance. They knew they couldn't really fight the British, but they weren't going to just give in either.
It's like walking this tightrope between control and cooperation.
Hmm.
You can't just make people accept a new system right away.
Yeah.
How did Durand deal with this? Did he have to change his strategies?
Yeah, he realized that governing these places took more than just military power he needed to get the people on his side, or at least keep them from resisting too much. So he started focusing on building relationships with the local leaders, listening to what they had to say, and trying to find ways to incorporate their existing customs and practices into the new administration.
So finding that middle ground between British authority and local traditions, it must have been a constant back and forth.
Yeah, it definitely was, and not everyone was happy with his approach. Some British officials thought he was giving too much away, and some local leaders thought he was just trying to trick them.
It's a good example of how diplomacy means dealing with all these competing interests and points of view. But while Durand was trying to figure all of this out in Hunza and Naga, there was another problem brewing, right? You mentioned an uprising in the Indus Valley. What happened there?
That's right, just when things seemed to be calming down, a new threat popped up in 1892. The Shins, this really powerful group in the Indus Valley, they rebelled against the Kashmir government, which was basically controlled by the British.
So the resistance was still there, just waiting for a chance to flare up what caused this uprising.
It was a combination of things: resentment towards the Kashmir government, economic problems, and the influence of religious leaders. The Shins felt like their way of life was being threatened, and they saw this as a chance to fight back and regain their independence.
It sounds like a really tense situation. What did Durand do?
He knew he had to act fast. A small group of British officers were trapped in a fort surrounded by the Shins rebels. Durand realized that if he didn't get reinforcements there quickly, they wouldn't survive.
That's a really dangerous situation.
Yeah.
You can see how quickly things could get out of control on the frontier. How did he handle it?
He had to use all his experience and knowledge of the area. He set up supply lines, got troops moving, and built bridges so they could cross the rivers. He even had to deal with a smallpox outbreak that threatened everyone, both the locals and his own men.
Wow, that's a lot to deal with all at once.
Hmm.
He had military, political, and even medical crises to handle. How did he pull it off?
Well, it shows how strong of a leader he was. He combined military force with diplomacy. He negotiated with some of the local tribes and managed to isolate the rebel leaders. Eventually, he was able to put down the uprising, but not without a lot of fighting and casualties on both sides.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even when you win, there's always a price to pay. These events must have really affected how Durand viewed the Gilgit frontier and his own part in it.
Yeah, definitely throughout Durand's account, we see his understanding of the region change. He started as a young officer wanting to prove himself and serve the empire. He went through so much, from dangerous trips to cultural misunderstandings and political schemes. He saw how beautiful the landscape was and how strong the people were, but he also saw the horrors of war and the bad sides of colonialism.
It's been a fascinating journey with adventure, intrigue, and a lot to think about. What do you think is the most important thing we can learn from Durand's experiences?
I think the most important thing is that Durand's story shows us the human side of history. He's not just a name in a book or a symbol of British power. He's a real person, making tough choices in a world that's constantly changing. His story reminds us that history is about more than just dates and battles. It's about the choices people made, the relationships they formed, and how those decisions affected everything that came after.
And it helps us understand how complicated colonialism was and what it left behind Durand's story Gives us this inside look at that world with all its problems and contradictions.
That's right. And it makes us think about some important questions. How do we balance the goals of empires with the lives of the people they affect? What are the long-term effects of those encounters, both good and bad? And how can we use what we've learned from the past to create a better future?
Those are questions that are still relevant today as we continue to deal with issues of power, identity, and cultural understanding all over the world. Well, thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive into the Gilgit frontier. Through the experiences of Algernon Durand, it's been a really eye-opening experience. We hope you'll join us again next time as we explore more hidden stories and dig deeper into the past.